This is Word of Mouth. I'm Jim Wunderlich, and my guest today is Deborah Hufford, author of the award-winning novel Blood to Rubies. Published in September 2023, Blood to Rubies is an Amazon bestseller and has won many awards, including Book of the Year from the American Writing Awards. New York Times bestselling author William Kent Kruger said, Blood to Rubies is nothing short of phenomenal and is destined to be a classic. In addition to being a novelist, Deborah Hufford is an award-winning magazine writer and magazine editor with stories in the New York Times Magazine, Connoisseur, Better Homes and Gardens, and many, many other titles. She is internationally known for her popular historical blog, Notes from the Frontier, with more than 100,000 readers. She also served as publisher of the Writer's Handbook and the Writer's Magazine imprint. She has a master's degree from the University of Iowa, where she taught Writers Workshop students at the Center for the Book. She has also taught graduate writing and publishing courses at Northwestern University and Marquette University. And Deborah is here today to discuss Blood to Rubies, a sweeping Western saga about Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce told through the lens of frontier photographer Frederick Cortland. And Deborah Hufford, I tell you, welcome to Word of Mouth. Such a pleasure to have you on the air.
Oh, thank you, Jim. This is such an honor to be here.
You know, I loved your book. I mean, just loved it. And you created so many wonderful characters that we're going to talk about, actually, in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk about your interest in Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. Alan Pinkham, who's a descendant of Chief Joseph, said in the foreword of your book, even though Blood to Rubies is a fictitious tale in the Northwest Territory in the 1800s, it rings true. It is deeply researched and depicts little-known facts and native perspectives that most Americans have never read. And I just have to ask you, who or what inspired you to write a historical novel about Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce?
Well, Jim, I grew up as an Iowa farm girl with horses and dogs and cats and lots of critters. And I loved animals, and I rode my childhood horse Sundance bareback on backcountry roads and winding paths along the Des Moines River Valley. And there were lots of remnants of Native American history and pioneer history in that area. Pioneer cemeteries, Indian mounds, old stagecoach traces, buffalo wallows. So it was really a wonderful place to grow up. And I was a voracious reader, and I read a lot. I loved horses, and I read a lot about horses in Native American history. And of course, the Nez Perce were my favorite tribe because they developed the beautiful Appaloosa horse. And their most famous leader was Chief Joseph, who at a very young age I came to really admire and I read a lot about.
What did you admire about him the most?
Oh, boy. Well, I call him actually sort of the Nelson Mandela of the Western frontier, because he was in a terrible, terrible situation in which his 10 or 20,000 year civilization was being attacked by the white juggernaut, and he was the person who had to try to save his people and save his culture. And he had just a tremendous amount of dignity and integrity, and he tried his very hardest to work with the military and with American leaders to honor, peace and to coexist with them, until finally it was just impossible not to fight back. And then they did. So he really is an amazing man. So
essentially, he was a non-violent person until it just came to shove, is from what I understand.
Absolutely. And I should mention that the Nez Perce, they hold such an amazing role in American history. They actually saved Lewis and Clark and their expedition from starving and freezing to death in the Bitterroot Mountains. They found them after they had eaten all their horses and most of their dogs, and were dying. And so they nursed them back. They gave them, replenished their horses. They built them canoes, and they showed them the Northwest Passage, which was the raison d'etre for the expedition. They also spent probably the most time of any native tribe that Lewis and Clark encountered during their expedition. And 70 years later, they were the last tribe to fight a major Indian war with the U.S. government. So there are a lot of ironies there.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, that is ironic. They helped the hand that bit them, in a sense. I mean, I mean, it's just terrible. They helped those folks, and then they bit them right back. I guess that's really the tragedy and the irony of the Nez Perce and Chief Joseph. And you there are facts like that you. And by the way, to say that the book is factual is true, but you have a lot of fictitious characters, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the interesting thing is there are a lot of kind of like little known facts. In fact, your Alan Pinkman had mentioned that in your foreword. The fact that there's little known facts about Native Americans that most Americans have never read. That would be one of them. Is there another one that you might want to share with us?
Yes. One of my main characters in Blood to Rubies is a Nez Perce warrior woman, and she is based on a real character that was one of Alan Pinkham's ancestors, and she fought alongside her husband at the battle of the Big Hole, and all along their 1,500-mile exodus. And at the Battle of the Big Hole, it came to nearly hand-to-hand combat, and her husband was shot and killed beside her, and she stood up and shot point blank the officer that had killed her husband. Now, she was 8 months pregnant at the time, and she was still fighting on the front lines, and she was gunned down in a fusillade, but she is celebrated among the Nez Perce. Also, one thing that I wanted to stress in this book is that, women have been written out of history for most of human history, and women warriors especially. And just now, we are starting to find out through archaeological digs and much deeper scholarly and unbiased research that women warriors existed all over the world. In fact, about 2 years ago, a Viking warrior queen, her grave was unearthed, and she was buried with about every Viking weapon that existed, and I think she was also buried with her war horse. And now they are finding these graves of warrior women and warrior women leaders in Russia and Mongolia and China and South America, Europe, Africa, all over. And one other really just shocking fact that I write about in my book that most Americans, I certainly never knew about it, was that at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, there were several female warriors of the Cheyenne tribe that participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And the Cheyenne, to this day, celebrate a 150-year oral tradition of one of those women who they claim actually killed Custer. You never read about that. Never
when I read that in the book, I was just, my jaw opened, because first of all, you get Custer as the hero in the history books I was reading back in the day. And since that, we've been able to revise that. But my jaw opened when I read that. And I thought that was very, very interesting. You actually, you write about pioneer women and you write about Native warrior women. Two of the characters that you write about, Sorrel Lanning, one of the pioneer women, boy, she's amazing. And I think you were actually referring to, when you were talking about your story before, it was modeled after or flying horses, the other woman. Is that the woman that you were talking about who fought with her husband? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So those two characters, while they're fictitious, They're based on, I assume at least, Sorrel is too. I don't know. I'm kind of curious. Mm-hmm. But both are based on at least strong, fierce, fighting women. And and they become blood sisters in the book, too, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. You have a pioneer women. Yeah. And, really, the Indians, and particularly the Nez Perce, they were so friendly to one another and so helpful. Yeah. And I guess... what qualities were you trying to demonstrate with their relationship? What was going through in your mind with that?
Yeah, well, they were both very strong-minded, confident women. They were physically strong and athletic. Certainly, they were very brave and adventurous. And they didn't really they weren't interested in tradition. I will put traditional in air quotes, female or feminine pursuits in their respective cultures. They both loved horses. They wanted to work with horses. And they also really resisted getting married because they both felt that would damn them to domestic roles and to the control of men, and they didn't want that. So they were really bound by those similarities and also their love of horses, and they were fiercely independent. And as it turns out, of course, there were many, many women in the West. Of course, they had to be independent. They had to be strong. They had to be very tough. And another fact that we just have never read about in our history books, or certainly not seen in Hollywood movies, is the fact that about a fourth of the homesteaders that came west for the Homestead Act were women.
Oh, my goodness. Women. Yes. No.
And they also had much, much better rates of proving their claims, which meant that they had to improve their land for 5 years to prove their claim. And they had a much higher rate than men did of doing that and staying on their land. So, again, it's... that sort of, I call it the John Wayne version of the West. There's so much that we never learned about, and that women were sort of written out of. So my book, I hope, remedies some of that, and I hope, well, from what I've heard from many readers, including many, many men, is that they love the history and they were fascinated by it. So.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't just, like from the book Shane, it wasn't like the pioneer woman who's just inside making muffins or biscuits while the men are out there cutting down a tree. And so, exactly. So actually it's books like Shane and history books that, basically build that stereotype our whole lives. And your book definitely has a lot of truth in it, and interesting truths. It's fascinating. It really is. Yeah. Now, actually, your main character, though, is a man, and the narrative of Blood and Rubies is told through the lens of a frontier photographer, which I thought was just genius. His name is Frederick Cortland, and we really see the Old West, the Wild West, through his eyes, and I'm interested. Did that character come from Ansel Adams, or how did the character originate? Who was that? Who was Frederick modeled after?
Well, there were many wonderful frontier photographers, but the two that really inspired me most were George Catlin, who was actually not a photographer, but a painter. And also Edward Curtis, who's very famous. You'll recognize him. He actually photographed the most famous image of Chief Joseph, although many photographers did photograph Chief Joseph. And they are special to me because they both believed that the native tribes were going to become extinct. They were going to be wiped out, and they really admired Native Americans and so many of the tribes, and they wanted to chronicle them before they disappeared. And I actually feature, I think, a couple of Edward Curtis's photographs, especially the most famous one of Chief Joseph, in my book. And I think I have three paintings by George Catlin as well. And he documented, I think, more than 40 tribes. And they're in full regalia, and he was a stickler for detail. And so his images are really fascinating.
You know, speaking of the photographs and also the portraits, that's such a big part of your book. And that's really what makes your book that much more interesting, or I should say, unique. I'm trying to think. The last book I had might have a couple pictures in it, but each one of your chapters, and there's a lot of chapters in your book. Each chapter opens up with this spectacular archival photograph that mirrors Frederick's. I'm talking about your main character, his journey, his adventures. And you'll have the photo before the chapter begins, and then as a reader, you know, oh, this photo will somehow relate to what's coming up in the chapter. And I got to tell you, I got so involved. I thought that I don't know how to put it, but I thought the photos were actually real to the story. So I got kind of sucked in a couple of different ways, and some of the photos, by the way, I mean, some are very pleasant. Some of them are very horrifying and graphic. You have one photo of two. I don't know how I put this. Two babies, twins, who died during childbirth, and they're in their coffins, and they look very sweet, but unfortunately they're deceased. And so and I had to look at that photo for a moment because I wasn't sure if they were sleeping or what. And then as you read the chapter, you find out, oh my goodness, Frederick, in addition to taking these wonderful photos of, or I should say the character, taking these wonderful photos of Chief Joseph, was also showing taking horrifying photos as well, because families would want those particular photos. Yeah. But I want to get back to my original question, which would be, what motivated you to use historical photos in your novel to reflect the narrative? Fascinating technique.
Yes, and actually it is extremely rare. They're after the war, for the 300-year history of novels, images were used. And in fact, The Grapes of Wrath in 1939 was illustrated by the famous artist Thomas Hart Benton. But after the war, fiction started, they deleted images, and it's extremely rare today to find any kind of fiction or any novels with images. But for my historical research, I went through hundreds of books, and I have many of them in my library, that tell the story of the West with so many archival images, many of them from these frontier photographers, but also many, many unknown photographers. And it was such a profound experience for me to see these images that I felt that I wanted my readers to experience that as well. And I really felt, I mean, some of the images actually prompted me to create actual characters from them. And there are also some very hard, gritty and pretty upsetting images. There were a couple that we decided not to use, simply because we thought that they were too graphic to use. But I did want to maintain that kind of grittiness and reality to my images and to my writing. So I think from the feedback that I've gotten that images are very effective. And at the back of the book, I make sure to credit all of these photographers, and I include, some of the history behind the photographs. I open with Ansel Adams' perhaps most famous photograph of the Tetons and the Snake River. That is a full page spread, and that is relevant because the Snake River was part of the Northwest Plateau where the Nez Perce, lived. And so it was very relevant to the story.
And they lived there in harmony, too. And they weren't bothering anybody. They were off on their own, but yet we had to just push them, which, just that part of it just brings you to tears. But, back to the photos. I'm kind of curious. It's kind of like a song. Does the music come first? Do the lyrics come first? So, hey, I have the writer here, so, it's not often you get to talk to the author if you've read the book. So, did the images drive the content, or did you have the content in mind and then you found the image? Or is it a little bit of both?
You know what? It was a little bit of both. And I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that in the beginning, I really did not start out with a plot line. I knew that my book would be about Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, so therefore it would take place in their homeland. And I knew, of course, the dates of the Nez Perce war, which was 1877. But beyond that, I didn't really have a plot line or many characters beyond that. And the images really did help me to create a plot line and my main character. And I did think, well, here are all these wonderful photographs that have inspired me, and why not make the main character a young frontier photographer who actually goes west to escape the Civil War draft. He's from Missouri, and all of his adventures, and he comes to settle in the Bitterroot Mountains and comes to know Chief Joseph. But the images certainly played a very prominent role in the unfolding of my book and my plot, and sometimes actually drove the narrative.
Well, Blood to Rubies and Frederick, just forgot his name. Sorry about that. Cortland, excuse me. His last name's only mentioned once or twice in this book, but Frederick is the person.
Hello?
Yeah. You can hear me, right? Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Frederick, he really, the pictures, and like you said, it chronicles the Wild West. I mean, you chronicle everything. This is an epic. Yes, it's about Chief Joseph and the tribe, but also it chronicles the underbelly of the Wild West. We're talking freak shows, hangings, and then the Oriental slave trade, which I knew a little bit about, but not a great deal about. And that aspect, I think a lot of us know about the freak shows and the hangings, but the Oriental slave trade. So what did you learn about the Oriental slave trade in your research for the book? And again, there's a photo that you have. Maybe you want to describe the photo in the beginning of one of the chapters that just brings you to tears.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, boy, the research that I found was just shocking about the Oriental slave trade. And one of my main characters, who is the bad guy, the villain, Cornelius Blades, he was a slave trader in the South before the Civil War. And there, some of the slave traders, of course, after the Civil War, although slavery did continue in some forms, underground, but some of those slave traders went west, and they simply plied their trade in the Oriental slave trade instead of the African American slave trade, and it is really, really quite shocking. One of my main characters, Ransom Fallon, who is a Welsh immigrant, goes west to San Francisco, which much of the Oriental slave trade existed, especially on the Barbary Coast. And I found just some amazing images, and also many newspaper articles that were written about this that were really shocking. And they use, of course, men and women were used in the slave trade, but primarily young women. And they were used primarily in the prostitution trade. And They were also shipped to Idaho and Oregon and all the territories, and they went to some of the mines and brothels and saloons, and where there were many men. And another aspect of the Oriental slave trade that I learned about was the Chinese tradition of foot binding, which, there are a lot of aberrations about female fashion, but this is one of the extreme ones, where they actually, with young girls, especially in the higher caste women, they would break their feet and bend back the feet, geez, and then bind them so they were just stumps. And they had special shoes that they wore, and a lot of times the flesh would rot off.
Oh boy, yeah.
It was just awful, and of course it rendered these women crippled. They were crippled for life. They could barely walk, let alone run or do any kinds of normal living. So I write about that sort of as a part of the symbolism of how women were subjugated, especially Chinese women. And I also include in my book a lot of excerpts from newspapers of the time, including San Francisco newspapers, who write about this abomination of Chinese prostitution. And many of the women suffered from just horrible cases of syphilis and other diseases, and were just left to die. And a lot of women, temperance women and church women developed movements to fight this plague and to save these women, and they wrote about it in the newspapers. So it's very fascinating, but also very horrifying. But a lot of the history of the West was.
Right.
Just was. It was violent.
The underbelly. And then, the image, one of the images I remember is this young Oriental girl in the back of a wagon with bars in front of her, and just the sadness in her face, and here's a real photo of it. And like we said, your main character, Frederick Cortlandt, is taking these photos in his very, very long life as he journeys across the Wild West. I want to get back to Ransom Fallon. You mentioned him. He's a character in your book, this Welsh man who's very good. He's the mysterious dark-haired man, good-looking guy.
Of course.
I kind of have, if I were going to make a movie, and it was back in the day, I probably would have had Gregory Peck playing this guy. Am I too far off? Is he kind of a Gregory Peck type of dude?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe... Yeah, I don't think Tom Cruise would cut it, but kind of a Gregory Peck guy. Is that where he came from, or were you thinking of some old character like that, or? And he's a decent man because he's kind of is like Atticus from To Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, he's got these real wonderful qualities about himself too.
Absolutely. Although he does do some dishonorable things.
Yes, he does.
In the book. But he is a Welsh immigrant who is actually forced to escape his homeland because he kills an wealthy English landowner who has attacked his lifelong love, whom he grew up with. And so he has to escape, and he goes to America accidentally, actually, and he ends up in America. And he is a very interesting character because he embodies so many of the dichotomies of the Welsh culture. Because the Welsh, many of them, they love literature, they love singing, and when they were subjugated by the English and they went down into the mines, they sang their Welsh ballads and songs down in the mines and became very famous as sort of quarry choristers. They were, and they are known for this music. So I say in the book that Ransom embodies these dichotomies of being both a pugilist and a poet, and a brawler, and a book lover in equal parts. He also has a deep sense of empathy for people, which I think makes him so attractive. And he's curious about people, and he's curious about women. And when he goes to a brothel, he takes the women out for a buggy ride if they aren't otherwise occupied. And he likes to hear their stories, and he respects them. So he is a very, very different kind of a hero.
Yes, he is. He does, though, have two relationships, or has relationships with two women, Sylvia and Sorrel. And, your novel, too, I mean, we want to make sure, too, it's a love story, too. I mean, there's you have that going on, and it's a sensual novel. There's a certain amount of sexual tension in it, particularly before characters get together. You got to wade through a lot of chapters to get there. Where are the good parts? Boy, I got to pay some dues here. I gotta learn about Chief Joseph here before I get to the good parts. No, I'm just kidding, because the book's a great ride. But you have the ability to understand. Let's put it this way, the male perspective. How are you able to write that male frame of mind? And I always wonder about that when men writers can write the women's frame of mind. And then you really do capture the male frame of mind with the sexual tension thing. Is that just, do you talk to other men, or how does that work? I know writers have to have empathy and all that kind of thing, but how does that transpire?
Yes, absolutely. That is part of it. But I also grew up a tomboy, and I really liked, I grew up with horses and animals, and I baled hay, and I, walked beans, and I slopped pigs, and I did all that stuff. And even a lot of traditional Iowa farm girls don't often get out there and work with the men. There's sort of oftentimes a division of labor, but I did because I loved it. And I also had a close relationship with my dad, who was, he was the traditional post-World War II man, macho, strong, loved sports, and he was a stock car racer. So he was really, a pretty tough guy. And I was inspired by him as well. And I loved movies. I especially loved war movies. So I really grew up with sort of a male sensibility anyway. And the other thing about Ransom that I will say that is sort of interesting about Western history is that men who traveled, men who were ship captains or cattle drovers or cowboys or, and a lot of men wandered too. They were able, some of them, ship captains infamously had mistresses or wives in every port. And they could get away with that because they didn't live in the age of social media. and distance really provided them a cover. So it was much easier to have these kinds of multiple liaisons. And I sort of wanted to touch on that in my book as well.
My guest today is Deborah Hufford, author of the award-winning novel Blood to Rubies. Published in September 2023, Blood to Rubies is an Amazon bestseller and has won many awards, including Book of the Year from the American Writing Awards. After the break, we'll discuss Deborah's process in writing a historical novel and her battle with kidney disease. This is Word of Mouth. I'm Jim Wunderlich. Back after this. In the background, you hear the Nez Perce, The Long Retreat, and that's by Peter Buffett. This is Word of Mouth. I'm Jim Wunderlich, and my guest today is Deborah Hufford, author of the award-winning novel Blood to Rubies, that was awarded the Book of the Year from the American Writing Awards. And if you're just joining the program, Blood to Rubies is a sweeping Western saga about Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, telescoped through the intimate stories and photographs of frontier photographer Frederick Cortland. And earlier we discussed the ironic and tragic journey of the Nez Perce and the rough and tough pioneers of the Wild West that Frederick Cortland met along the way. Let's shift gears a little bit. By the way, I understand you have a relationship, or you do know Peter Buffett, who we were just listening to his music. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I contacted Peter. I have always loved his music, and he is a composed part of the Dances with Wolves score, especially the Fire Dance. And also, he's worked extensively with Kevin Costner and wrote the entire score for 500 Nations, which you just played one of the tracks from that. And I wrote much of my book listening to Peter's music. I just loved it so much. And I contacted him some years ago and told him about, I had started a history blog called Notes from the Frontier. And I was also working on my book, so I told him about my work, and he was extremely generous, and he wrote the most awesome testimonial about my book. And then, he also is in close contact with Kevin Costner, so he sent a copy of my book to Kevin. I'm on a first-name basis with Kevin and Peter.
That's terrific.
So, and every author dreams of having their novel made into a movie. Who knows? But I also was able to get a testimonial from the film commissioner of South Dakota that was the scout for Dances with Wolves. And also 500 Nations. So he worked very closely for many weeks with Kevin Costner. And he wrote a wonderful testimonial about my book also, comparing it to Dances with Wolves. So I have been extremely lucky to have the support of many wonderful people like that, and many New York Times best-selling writers as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a tribute to the book, and, I love the book. I hope people will take a look at it, Blood to Rubies. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and discuss the process in writing Blood to Rubies. You're enjoying now that it's done, and it's published, and you're getting all this wonderful reviews, but there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and toil that go through that. I have to ask you, when did you first sit down to write this book? It looks like it would take years, I would think.
Yeah, it did take years, decades in fact, but a lot of that was because I encountered some very significant obstacles. And I do have to just fess up and confess that although I had wanted to write this book since I was a child, I was really intimidated. I mean, I had become a magazine writer and editor, and with very, very respectful credits. But I was afraid of fiction, and part of that reason is because when I went to undergrad and graduate school at the University of Iowa, and I taught Writers' Workshop students, and I also printed posters for all of the famous writers that spoke at the Writers' Workshop. Kurt Vonnegut, John Barnes, John Irving, Marilyn Robbins.
Stephen King, Elmore Leonard, all sorts of hot shots. You were in the company with.
Definitely hot shots. The best in the world, Pulitzer Prize winners and Nobel Prize winners, and growing up or working in that rarefied environment of literature, it really intimidated me. I didn't think I had the creative chops to write fiction. So I was a feature story writer for magazines and started my career out at Better Homes and Gardens. But the thing that shocked me into start to write my book was when I became pregnant with my daughter about 30 years ago. It went well until the very end, and then all hell broke loose. And my blood pressure shot up, and I had preeclampsia, and they diagnosed me with end-stage kidney disease. It turned out that each of my kidneys was functioning at about 10%.
Oh, my goodness.
Which is why, pregnancy is very, very hard on kidneys. So when I was diagnosed with kidney disease, and very severe kidney disease, then I felt the urgency to start writing. And I thought, I don't know how long I'm going to be on this earth, and I better get going on this. And so I wrote my book with the sort of Damocles above me that whole time, thinking I don't have very much time. And I even made my daughter and my husband promise that if I didn't publish my book, if I didn't make it, that I wanted them to try and publish it. So I started writing, but I also had a full-time job as an editor, a magazine editor, and features writer, and that took all of my time during the day, and raising a family. So, and also it was a stressful job, so I was a chronic insomniac. So I started writing almost all of my book between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning when I had insomnia.
Jeez.
And my dogs and my cat would sit on my feet as I wrote, which is very comforting. And so I wrote the majority of my book that way. And then about 3 years ago, I was finally, we were getting to the end, and I was put on a kidney donor list, and things were not looking good. And I was, again, very lucky, very, very blessed to have such a wonderful family. And 5 of my family members stepped up to volunteer their kidneys, even my 90-year-old mother, who, of course, didn't qualify. And my husband was the first, and he was automatically disqualified because he had high blood pressure, and he was on 2 blood pressure medicines. Well, they never take donors who they don't want to endanger their lives. So he was not a good candidate. So I had other family members, including my 2 sisters, who volunteered, only to find out that they had kidney disease also. They had 50% function. And what ended up happening is my husband, through just a Herculean effort, decided to try to lower his blood pressure through lifestyle changes. He quit drinking. He started exercising, swimming. And we went on a plant-based diet and with low salt and all of that. And he eventually, through many months of doing this, qualified. He was able to get off one of his drugs and then finally off both of the drugs. And almost a year later, he was approved as my kidney donor. And that very, very same day, I was notified that a publisher, a really wonderful publisher, wanted to publish my book. So it's 2 miracles in one day. I just couldn't believe it. I just could not believe it. So it is quite a story.
I assume after you have a kidney transplant, the recovery process must take a while, I would think. Was that like a year of just recovering from that, or?
Yeah, they do say that it really does take a year, and over 80% of kidney transplant patients actually end up back in the hospital for various reasons. It's a very, very serious surgery, and it's a shock to the body to get this new alien kidney that it's not used to. And transplant patients need to take very, very powerful immune-suppressing drugs because otherwise the body will try to reject the kidney. It will see it as an invader. So, and what that does is the flip side of that is it also makes kidney patients very vulnerable to viruses and infections. And so I actually returned to the hospital 4 different times over a 4-month period. And it was hard. It was very challenging. But I'll tell you, Jim, I was so happy and felt so just overjoyed that I got a new kidney, and my book was being published, that nothing could get me down. And I worked. I had my laptop the entire time that I was in the hospital, and I was working on the final edits and working with an art director on my book the entire time. And I do have to just call out all medical professionals, and especially nurses. I had my transplant at Aurora St. Luke's in Milwaukee. It's the largest, and it has just a spectacular kidney transplant program. And all the staff, and especially the nurses, made my stay there so wonderful and just so life-affirming. I cannot thank them enough. So I'm a happy cowgirl.
So you are healthy today then? You feel okay?
Very, very healthy, yes. The healthiest I've felt in years. And I have my old energy back. When I was in the very end stages and on the kidney transplant list, I was sleeping about 16 hours a day. I was just always exhausted. It was very trying.
Well, going back to also the writing process, so you're writing when you're going through all these obstacles, these health issues, and at 2, as you said, between 2 and 4 in the morning, other than having the insomnia and writing at that time, in terms of the writing process, what's the most challenging part to write? They talk about writer's block and these types of things. I was just curious about that.
Well, I'm lucky. I have never had that. In fact, if anything, I'm inundated with too many ideas. I hope I never have it. But the hardest part, my book is a historical fiction. And I think, personally, in my humble opinion, that historical fiction is one of the hardest genres to write, because you're writing around a construct, a historical construct that was real. And you have to do a lot of research. You have to make sure that your dates and are correct, that the sequence of dates is correct, that your characters are true to the time. And especially when you write about Native American history in the West, it's especially challenging because, I talked about the John Wayne version of the West, but I preferred to work very extensively with the Nez Perce tribe and elders and Alan Pinkham to make sure that their version was the version that I was writing, and it's also a version that many historians may not have even read about. But I think it's important that the American people and that all of us know about the Native American versions that are finally coming out in this day and age. So that was the most challenging part of it. But I also loved it, to do the research. And one of the greatest honors of my life was to work with Alan Pinkham, who is still alive. He's 85 years old. Just an amazing man. And I think he has a photographic memory, too.
Is he associated with the Smithsonian? Is he associated with the Smithsonian? Am I thinking of the same Alan Pinkham?
Yes.
He's very well known.
Not only was he the chairman of the Nez Perce tribe for well over a decade, and he's a very, very well-known national scholar, historian of tribal history, Nez Perce history, but he was also on the founding board of the Smithsonian's a National Museum of the American Indian.
That's right.
And he has talked extensively about that. If you can imagine how daunting a task that would have been to go through the Smithsonian collections and to work with, trying to create a museum that represents 700 tribes across North America, and to do justice, and oftentimes to present a narrative that is not what many Americans thought. It was a very daunting task, and he was up to that task. So, again, just an amazing man.
deeply devoted to social justice for Native Americans. And I know you're involved with the Chief Joseph Foundation. Tell me about that. What's that all about?
Oh, Jim, I'm so very glad that you mentioned that. I am so devoted to their mission, and I am donating a portion of the proceeds of my Blood to Rubies sales to the Chief Joseph Foundation. Ellen founded, along with another woman elder named Bonnie Ewing, founded the Chief Joseph Foundation. And their mission is to mentor not just Nez Perce, but other tribal youth to become empowered, to learn about their tribal traditions and their culture, and also, hand in hand with that, to become better students and to become first-generation college goers and trade school students. It is such an important mission. And one of the reasons that it has proven to be extremely effectual, and it sent many young Nez Perce youth to college. But it also, one of the aspects of this program, their Mounted Scholars Program, is that they also sponsor these youth to go on the Chief Joseph annual trail ride. And that ride is based on Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce 1,500-mile exodus through the most rugged land on the face of the earth. That trail crosses the Continental Divide twice. It goes through Hell's Canyon, the deepest gorge in North America. It goes through Yellowstone. It is really, really rugged territory. And these youth, the Nez Perce Foundation provides Appaloosas. The only Appaloosas are allowed on this ride. And these youth ride these Appaloosas on the ride and retrace Chief Joseph's steps. And elders teach them about the battles that the Nez Perce fought. And the interesting thing about this is really a sacred tradition for them, because many of their ancestors fought and died at these battles. So it is really an important rite of passage for them. And because I grew up with horses, I know how important they were to me, really defined me as a person. And I know that their association with horses and with their culture really helps them. So I really hope that your listeners will look the Chief Joseph Foundation up, and it is really an amazing organization.
My guest today is Deborah Hufford, author of the award-winning novel Blood to Rubies, that was awarded the Book of the Year from the American Writing Awards. This is Word of Mouth. I'm Jim Wunderlich. Back after this quick break. And this is Word of Mouth. I'm Jim Wunderlich. My guest today is Deborah Hufford, author of the award-winning novel Blood to Rubies, which was awarded the Book of the Year from the American Writing Awards. And earlier we discussed the process in writing an historical novel and the many obstacles, personal and professional, that Deborah had to overcome while writing the book. And in the background you hear the song The Buffalo Hunt from the film Dances with Wolves, music by John Barry. And Kevin Costner's name has come up during this interview, along with Dances with Wolves. You know, we're getting towards the end. We have a couple minutes, Deborah, and I understand you have a book that might be coming out in another year or so, and it's about Chicago. So I definitely want to make time for that before we have to say goodbye. Your next book is called Sapphires and Ashes, and it's about Chicago and Mayor William Ogden. I noticed that you keep the gem theme. You're going to go from rubies to sapphires. What's the plot of this historical novel? Sounds very interesting.
Yes, well, it is. In my opinion, it is about the night of October 8th, 1871, and many Chicagoans will recognize this date because it was the night of the Great Chicago Fire that burned a third of the city and killed 250 people. But what most of the world, and probably most Chicagoans, don't know is that that was not the worst fire in the United States that night. The worst fire was 250 miles north in the northlands of the forest land of Wisconsin, near Peshtigo, Wisconsin. And that burned 1.5 million acres and killed 10 times the number of people that died in Chicago, 2,500 people. And it remains today the worst fire in American history. And again, it's history that so many people don't know about. And the big linkage in this book is that one man owned most of the land that burned that night, most of the Chicago land and most of the Peshtigo land. That man was William Ogden, who was the first mayor of Chicago. And he was a very, very interesting man, one of the founders of Chicago. And he's a main character in the story, and also a poet lumberjack, and a Swedish immigrant who is a brothel owner, and and also a Turkish young woman who is a lion tamer, comes from Turkey and brings her 3 lions. So it's a very interesting book, very similar again to Blood to Rubies, wonderful obscure history, very gritty, lots of romance, lush, and it's about the cost of unfettered progress in the growth of our nation. So.
Well, I tell you what, once that book is released, and I've read it, we have to have you back on again. We're plumb out of time right now. So sorry. But, boy, it was just a pleasure.
I would love that. Thank you.
Well, Deborah Hufford, thank you so much for being on the program today. Just an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to your staff and also to all your listeners. This has just been so much fun. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And if you wish to contact Deborah, visit her website, www.deborahhufford.com. And my next show will be on Thursday, February 15th at 11 a.m. This is Word of Mouth. I'm Jim Wunderlich. Have a great day.